Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Oblivion. So, this is kind of an interesting sci fi film that really is to be like, it has to have, like, it has these like cool action sequences. There are some interesting things that eventually this movie does do. Uh, One thing that I probably do also have to say about this movie is they really want to break down like the science of the whole, like, if the world was to end, like, how would we use its resources to create this kind of energy mining like thing from water. We're gonna like hydroplane the water and create this energy source. And I'm just like, why are we, like, why are we going through all this? And but it's funny. um so going into this movie, there isn't actually much like actual names for any number of these like futuristic like stuff. Like Jack is just to be called a technician. The drones that are kind of going around are just be called drones because technically Jack is a drone technician. Victoria is just a woman who is to basically just sit around in this sky tower and kind of give Jack the kind of layout of what he is supposed to do, or eventually help him when problems are to arise via hundreds upon hundreds of miles away. The ship that they are to go into in this movie is to be called the Bubble Ship. The bike that Tom Cruise is to eventually go on a mission on is to just be this custom Honda bike. There isn't an actual title or something like that of the actual bike. They just call it a Honda thing. So the interesting thing about this movie is, especially if you have at once upon a time been in been in New York, or have lived in New York, or are living in New York. There, of course, are to be some interesting, just kind of parts of New York in this piece, where we, of course, have the Empire State Building, the MetLife Stadium, and the New York Public Library is to be in one of the scenes here, where it's to be kind of rubbled out. Uh, Going into this film, like, really out of the gate, there has to be this kind of breakdown of science and whatever. They end up talking about these scavengers and this invasion, but like they really never really help you understand like if this is some kind of alien thing or whichever, because eventually they want to leave it to be a mystery. So going into this film, like eventually the further and further we go into this film, the more at some points it's just like, well, what is really left of the earth, like, is basically just, is everything a lie? Is there not really any true legitimate, like, is there no life left on earth? Is there no life left, period? Because really we are to be told within this movie that supposedly everyone had been taken from earth and is now like deciding to go on to Titan. And I find that hard to believe. I'm like, wait a minute. So everybody wanted to be shifted to Titan, which is Jupiter's moon. And like everybody was just fine kind of leaving this earth that you can still breathe in Earth is still a breathable planet. Um but I guess with all the horrible weather patterns there and stuff like that, I just can't like quickly in my own mind believe that a whole entire planet would just eventually abandon Earth when Earth still at least has breathable air. within it, and you have humans that are technically existing on it. I just find it hard to believe that they would just pull the ripcord on Earth and eventually head to some other planet, which we are not sure is actually a breathable planet or not. But I guess you could really just look at Interstellar, and you would probably just be like, well, there's been a lot of people that have just wanted to really go off and find other planets that are to have breathable oxygen, air, and whatever, for eventually us to eventually jump to that planet. Wouldn't that be an interesting film to eventually just be like, hey, like Earth 2 or another Earth? Like that might have happened at some point, like when probably looking at that Val Kilmer movie, where eventually Val Kilmer is to go and be an astronaut with the girl from who plays Trinity on Matrix. I think that's called like Red Planet or something like that, where eventually Val Kilmer is to say that Mars has breathable air now, and so yeah, so like I guess that technically could be quasi similar to a Earth, an alternate Earth. But anyways, pushing on. So there is pieces and stuff about this film that do kind of break down as this interesting piece, but overall it just kind of gets more and more just like, huh? You're just kind of like, huh? At some parts of this film. Um, like I just probably have to really just enjoy the visuals that are to unfold in this movie, and that's about it. There's a lot of intelligence to be spewed out for probably anybody who is to have uh, really just gone on and wanted to like, yeah, I want to see if all of this is really true, and I want to like know the science behind it, and I want to figure out how like if this could actually be a reasonable thing, or if like this doesn't make any actual sense. So yeah, we have that kind of played into this movie. So what is to technically go on into this film if I haven't technically teed it up, which I technically feel like I have. So a girl named Jack and Victoria are to seemingly be the only people left on planet Earth, and they are to be going and doing these protective or security measures to keep uh, these hydro mining things that are going and taking water and transforming it into energy. They're basically securing these things to keep doing their job, to eventually have these things be sent off, I guess, to eventually help either the Sky Tower keep running, their guns to continue to be weaponized and otherwise operational, and so on and so forth. It seems like everything is to eventually possibly be running on this energy and then some. So eventually, both Jack and Victoria are to supposedly go back to Titan within 2 weeks. And so they're just like, yeah, we're finally almost home. We're finally almost done. And we kind of have this like kind of repeated lingo that is to consistently happen throughout this film, where we end up having Sally's character who is to consistently ask, and I'm sure this probably would have gotten annoying, where Sally is to ask both Jack and Victoria if they are an effective team. And so Victoria's like, heck yeah. Like, of course we are. Uh-huh. Yeah, like we haven't heard this like 50 times already. So but yeah, so they continue to sprinkle that in to really just have us believe that maybe Sally is just an AI, artificial life form, and they're not actually talking to a legitimate person. It seems to me in my mind. So Jack and Victoria are eventually going and starting to run out of resources because eventually certain drones are starting to not have certain parts, and eventually Victoria is to be like, well, hey, I sent out for parts. So eventually it's starting to be so that, like, they're just like, man, I can't wait to freaking get out of here. I can't wait to just freaking, like, either go to Titan or wherever the heck that they're legitimately going to do within these 2 weeks, because they're just like, God, like, this is just like, we're barely scraping by, but like Sally is to tell us that we're doing a really good job uh, with what we have. So, but eventually, Tom is to consistently have these dreams that he is to be on the Empire State Building, when actually his mind had supposedly been erased. And so these dreams and these memories are starting to come back to Jack. And the more and more that he is starting to dream, the more and more he is starting to realize that he should eventually become this much more defiant person that is not just going to be happy to go on Titan within X number of days, that eventually Jack needs to really understand or have someone help him understand what's really going on. So, and eventually Morgan Freeman, which of course you see here, will eventually help this man out. Like, at some point, this does almost, like, there's something about this that does feel like a tiny smidgen bit of, like, Demolition Man in some kind of ways. Uh, because you kind of have, like, a Dennis Leary character who is to be this guy who's like this underground like person, um, who is just kind of making his stand against the Earth. And we have Stallone's character, which is technically Tom Cruise's character in this, which is just to be like forced to do his job, not really realizing what exactly he's in for, or not exactly realizing what is to have actually really be like unfolding, because there's something that he just doesn't know. Like, all Stallone really knew in Demolition Man was to go after Simon and take him out, and that's all that he was to ever really to know. Then cue us having the actual government come in and want to eventually just put forth an effort to have Simon go and trying to kill Dennis Leary's character, the leader of the resistance. And so then eventually becomes that Stallone's character not only has to take care of Simon, but then also has to take care of the government of this story, and eventually, like, try to do the right thing. Which eventually is how this movie kind of plays out. So, with that said, uh, really, that's just all that I really just want to say about this movie, and I just, like, took 13 minutes. Man, I used to remember when, like, this teeing up thing and this whatever would have only taken 5 minutes, and then I would just get right to the spoilers. But I'm having fun with it, and obviously this is a 2-hour movie anyway, so I don't think I'm gonna go and get to that 2-hour time. So yeah, like, the only so like the good, there is really good, interesting visuals in here. The bad about this film is just they have to go into this very, like, smart, intelligent approach to this, and there really has to more and more be at a point in this movie where you consistently get confused. But other than that, like, it's just a movie to just enjoy the ride, and a cool sci-fi visual movie that barely has any cast in it. That, like, really just have, like, very few things of like, I wonder if, like, they basically just catered this movie to, like, give to Tom Cruise, because it's like, hey man, uh like, we just need Tom Cruise to do another film, because I think Tom Cruise was eventually latching himself on to certain studios, and like he basically had them like have to put him in certain movies per the year or whatever, and so eventually this might have just been one of those where he just got like chucked in here really just because like there wasn't much of him to do like stunt wise, but he was really just there to eventually do another film. So with that said, let's go out of our way to that double five time territory. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this movie. So very beginning of it, we have this kind of breakdown of the science of how the world was to have gone into effing itself up, because eventually it seemed space travel was more of a thing during whatever time that this movie was to take place. And it seems that eventually there were these things called scavengers that were to go onto the moon and basically destroy it because they were to, I guess, be mining the moon and eventually just destroyed it. And all of a sudden, the destruction of the moon, which I'm like, dude, I've seen like movies where they destroy the moon way too often. Like what comes to mind is like the Time Machine movie, the more recent one, whatever recent one is during this time period, probably the only one that history ever done. Um, like they blew up the moon. Like how many movies do we have to see? Like somebody doing something with the moon. It happens far too often. So all of a sudden, because the moon is now gone, all of a sudden now we have the weather who is like as if it's a person. We have the weather, that weather guy, that weather thing. Like it's getting out of control. That weather, all of a sudden creating so many tornadoes, like basically turning this world into a day after tomorrow kind of thing. If anybody remembers the Jake Gyllenhaal Dennis Quaid movie, where like freaking lightning and thunder and tsunamis and all kinds of craziness was to happen upon the earth. And so it eventually ended up wiping out a number of things. So eventually people had decided, instead of hanging on to earth, they all decided to go into space, and then eventually arrived to make it onto Titan, which is supposedly Jupiter's moon, and live there. So eventually they just left certain people to mine for resources off of the earth to eventually, I guess, help out in the big scale of things to eventually send resources either back to Titan or any number of things. So it also seems like Titan eventually being a place to go to is also like that's also a thing to consistently do. Look at the end of like Eureka, where eventually the guys, the way that show ended was like the last season was them going into Titan. You can check it up or check it up, check it out. Anyways, I think we also have like the movie like Titan AE or something like that. I don't remember. It's been such a long time since I've seen that, but I know there's like some weird title that sounded like that. People can correct me if they want. So, uh, going on. So now, of course, we have Jack, we have Victoria, and they are to be having these drones to kind of protect these mining like things. And so, like I said, Jack is this drone technician, and Victoria just sits behind this desk and is just to kind of eventually help Jack from time to time by telling him things, because that's all she could really do. I'm like, what is the point of this? What is the point of Victoria, honestly? Um, like, basically, Victoria is kind of doing Sally's job because, like, there is even at some points where Jack is to tell Victoria, like, well, hey, do you want to go and you want to leave? You want to go and, like, just check things out? And Victoria is like, well, you know I can't go anywhere. And so it's like, so what is Victoria even doing here? Like, what is her real, like, is she, like, they're not gonna, like, procreate and make a baby, so, like, what is the point of her being here? But anyways, it seems that both Jack and Victoria had had their brain wiped to eventually because here's my problem also. What happens if Jack gets sick, gets injured, gets whatever? Like, is basically this mission just effed? Where eventually they're gonna have to go and talk to Sally and be like, "Well, I guess I guess we're not an effective team. I guess you're just gonna have to kill us off." Or is Jack gonna have to like just do his missions anyways, even though he's sick or injured or whatever? That would have been an interesting thought process to eventually go into this movie with, to eventually see Jack at some point have a cold or something. I would have been interested by that. Um, to see how they were to go about doing things, forcing Victoria to have to get off of her desk at some point. That's my thought process. Anyways, pushing on. So Jack, of course, is to eventually find out that there is to be a drone. That, of course, is to be down, and I guess it's to be down right in the middle of MetLife Stadium. So Jack eventually is to go out to MetLife Stadium and is to eventually go and look at this wall that says 2017 champions. And so Jack is like, wow, yeah, like, hey, like, I remember that one Super Bowl, like the whole story about it, where eventually the quarterback was to fumble the ball, and then he ends going and tossing it to the receiver, and then he ends going and doing a touchdown. It's like, yeah, and how great everybody felt, and so, like, just replaying over this whole story about what ended up happening. So eventually, Jack is to somehow get this drone power cell to eventually work within it. And so Jack also has to put some gum into the drone to eventually get it working. And so the drone starts working, and it seems there is to be a time where Jack is to have the drone have to scan him to just be like, oh, he's not a threat. But like the drone has to take the time to consider whether or not that Jack is a threat or not, which is just kind of weird. And Jack has to mutter like who he is and like his numbers and all that kind of jazz. So the drone ends up just going off, and so Jack is just having some condescending thing to say to this 166 drone. It's just like, oh, you're welcome. like I just saved your Batukas, but like really they needed that drone to work anyways. So eventually Jack is to at some point go off to his seemingly secret hideout and is to tell Victoria that he's going to be on radio silence for a while. So Jack is to go off to go into this kind of like hideout house where like I guess he had taken the time to just put this whole thing together. And we also have, of course, Jack who ends up tossing on the New York Yankees hat, which I'm just like, okay, so now I think we've seen Tom Cruise wearing a New York Yankees hat now twice when looking at uh, uh, World of Tomorrow or War of Tomorrow, the one alien movie, War of the Worlds. There we go. Yeah, I've seen too many Tom Cruise movies. And then, of course, this one where he's to wear the Yankees hat also. So, going into this film, pushing on, so eventually Tom is to come back and to eventually go at some point, and him and Victoria are to skinny dip into the pool and kiss one another. And so when both of them are going under the water, Jack, instead of seeing Victoria, he ends up seeing a girl named Julia. And so Jack just can't, like, he can't get this girl's face out of his head for whatever reason. And every time he has to dream that he's back at the Empire State Building, and he is to be going to the Empire State Building with this girl named Julia for whatever reason. And supposedly Jack is to tell us in the beginning of this movie that Jack had supposedly, as well as Victoria, had their mind erased so that way there wouldn't be certain kind of information that they could divulge to the scavengers, whoever they eventually are to be. So now let's push on to eventually getting because there's a lot of like slow points here. uh Jack eventually is to uh go on and have two drones be down around one of these mining places that are to be these hydro uh mining facility places. I don't know the technical term. I think the bubble ship and the sky tower is technical enough for me. So eventually, now Jack is to have to forcibly go and take care of these, uh, take care of these drones yet again, and so eventually Jack is to at some point uh, be forced into this one location that is to be uh, this kind of hole of sorts that is to lead him into the New York Public Library, where all of a sudden he is to eventually get into a fight with all these scavengers. And so all of a sudden, one of the drones ends up coming down and is to scan all over the place and is to eventually go and wipe out all these scavengers. And so now Jack has to kind of like jump out and just be like, hey, like, I'm Jack, technician. Like, hey, like, stop doing what you're doing. So eventually the drone flies off again because there is no threat here. So, because eventually Jack tried to like escape this whole ambush that he was in, but once he was to try and go and kind of grappling gun back up or grappling hook back up with this rope, someone was to eventually cut off this rope and steal his bike. Eventually, when uh, Jack had to give up the ship, the bubble ship, to eventually go and take this bike because he had to go supposedly um, like off roading kind of thing. So, funny enough, supposedly this bike that was to be put in this movie could not actually run very far. Supposedly, this bike had, I guess, 20 minutes of actual riding ability. And so I'm just like, wait a minute, like, how could they have done that during this film? Because supposedly they had to customize this bike so much so that really it couldn't ride for very long, because supposedly they had to like adjust certain things or hide certain things, and that kind of affected the bike's ability to just kind of go for long cuts and distances and whatever. So, like, I guess technically, if they were to have like rode the bike quick enough, like maybe they would have been able to like figure out how to easily been able to use this bike. Hence why I guess why you don't have it being used so heavily in this film, and so on and so forth. So there's and plus there's also certain times where I'm sure like they just kind of took the bike and just had it like just kind of being dragged around for whatever, like, and there was probably like any of the close-up shots were probably not really actually Tom Cruise actually riding the bike, even though he can, because Tom Cruise can ride anything. Also, Tom Cruise for the whole bubble ship. they actually got a lot of ideas from Tom Cruise for how that it was to have actually worked, um, or how he would have wanted it to actually work. Um, because I'm sure he's gone and like actually done any number of helicopters and stuff like that. So like really they had to come up with some kind of science behind it actually working. And I'm sure like Tom was eventually to kind of give his 2 cents about how it should look or whatever. So going on, so pushing on. So eventually Jack, while being at the New York Public Library, he ends up going and grabbing this one book that had almost burnt. And so eventually Jack is to pick this book up to eventually find out that it's called Lays of Ancient Rome by Thomas Babington. Um, and evidently it's a poetic book of sorts. And so Jack kind of hearing this or going and seeing this certain passage in this book is to just kind of make him like think about what's really going on here and making him starting to remember certain things even much more so than he probably would have, because this book I guess is a real incentive for him to eventually want to figure out what's really going on here. So Jack is to eventually go to the Empire State Building to try and see if he can remember anything, to eventually try and figure out if like there's some memory that jogs from him being there. And eventually there is also another reason for him to eventually go there in the film, because eventually Jack is to find out that the Empire State Building seems to be an antenna for the scavengers, and so eventually he is kind of like figured that out in this film. So going on, so we end up having a moment in this movie where eventually there is to be a ship that is to be that had been dropping these survivors. And so now Jack has to scramble to go and find these survivors. And he ends up realizing or finding out that the drones are starting to murder all of these survivors. And so now Jack is to have to scramble to kind of put his like body on the line to tell this drone, do not shoot these things. Like, I'm here, do not shoot these things, because for some weird reason, I guess this drone could not identify these survivors that are kind of in these little pod things. So the drone just started to shoot the survivors and kill them off for whatever reason. I guess because since these survivors were not supposed to be here, I guess they weren't verified to be here, and so now Jack had to go and save them from getting killed off. So the main reason why Jack had saved one of the pod-esh like people is because Julia was to be in this pod, and he's like, oh my god, like, this is the girl I've been dreaming about, and now I'm hoping that I can just kind of take her out of this container like thing to eventually talk to her and just maybe have some memories jog back of a previous life that I had at some point. So Jack takes Julia uh, back to this sky tower and is to open her up. And so eventually Jack at some point is to have Julia telling Jack like all of these things from before, kind of all these memories that they had together. And So Jack is like, well, yeah, I guess this is really and legitimately my wife, because Jack is starting to remember all these things as well. Like, eventually, him, both Jack and Julia going to the Empire State Building, and Julia mentioning about that she was to get engaged right then and there, and Jack is starting to remember these things, and now Jack is starting to remember everything. Eventually, Jack is to go with Julia back to the Sky Tower and to basically tell Victoria that Julia is his wife, and that Victoria is to now have to tell Sally that I guess they're no longer an effective team. So all of a sudden, we end up having this drone that ends up coming into the Sky Tower and shooting Victoria, because I guess all of these things are just kind of cloned anyway, so if they're not an effective team, just go and kill them off, because who cares? We can just find another team. We can eventually go and get someone else to do this whole thing. So, eventually Julia is to have to use the bubble ship to go and blast down this drone, and so eventually what is to kind of come out of this is that eventually Jack and Julia are to eventually make their way to find these scavenger people. And they end up actually finding out that the scavenger people are humans like them. And so Morgan Freeman is to actually be their leader and to be a guy named Beach. Weirdly. So Beach is to basically tell Jack that, like, hey, like, we're just like humans like you and I, and like there is probably a number of things that they probably aren't telling you, and you are probably starting to figure that out. So Beach is to eventually tell Jack his master plan, that Beach wants to basically go and take a drone and nuke this world, or to nuke the spaceship that all these clones are to come off on, to eventually have them be free, and to eventually just have to just be like have this planet for their own without having the scavengers worried about getting killed and so on and so forth. So eventually Jack is to more and more just consider that whole thing, but like he needs to take a little bit more time to really figure this out. But Beach is to tell Jack, well, hey, like, how about you go to a radiated zone and you find out what you're going to find out there, and then you come back to me. So Jack is like, okay. So Jack goes to supposedly a radiated zone that he should not go to eventually find out that there is just another Jack present there. That really, Jack was led to believe that he was the only real Jack there, and like we were just to be found out that like basically Jack's life is a lie. The main reason why Jack doesn't have memories is just so that way they can kind of control him more and be able to just force him to do what they want without him having to like be defiant. And so, and like Jack is to basically be told all these lies to cover up the truth that they're going throughout this entire earth and just having all of these jacks go on to get these resources for these people. So eventually Jack is to go and find Jack. And so now, like, we have one Jack who has this bandana, and we have one Jack who does not have a bandana. Like, that's to be the only real difference between the two Jacks. So eventually, the one new Jack is to eventually go against the other Jack and just to tell him, like, hey, like, put your gun down, put your weapon down. So they end up fighting one another out to eventually have uh, the older Jack go, or the more focused upon Jack, go and take out the new Jack and tie him up. So we we have the bubble ship that was to eventually go and have these drones start to go after it and to start like chasing after it. And so Julia and Jack are to eventually have to like figure out a way to outmaneuver with the bubble ship to try and take these drones out. And eventually they end up trying to use the lightning that is to go into the weather. Could I speak English? There's lightning coming from the weather because Jack was to have eventually gone into the bubble ship and gotten way too close to the storm, and all of a sudden he ended up getting lightning upon his bubble ship that ended up having him kind of spiral down, but luckily he was at the last second able to like curve into the fact of like survival and having the ship come back online right at the perfect time. So like we hilariously had Victoria, when Jack was to go on his first mission, tell him like, well, hey, be careful, and he's like, I always am, and it's like, no. So Jack eventually is to again go and fight off Jack, and so since both Jack and Julia were to crash their ship, Julia, I guess, had gotten injured, so like I guess her ribs are to be broken or something like that. So Jack goes off to other Jack's sky tower to go and talk to this Victoria. And so Jack is to tell this Victoria, like, well, hey, how about you come with me on this mission and you'll get to see some amazing things. And Victoria's like, well, you know, I can't do that. So eventually she kisses him and she's like, what's going on in that mind of yours? So Jack is like, well, hey, I gotta go off. I got something to do. Wouldn't she have looked at the stuff that Jack grabbed and it's like, well, hey, what do you need that for? Like you aren't going to leave here until you tell me what you need this equipment for. But Jack just goes off without her really having any no never mind about stuff. But it seems that both Jack and Victoria have had numerous disagreements about her going off on a mission. And so Victoria, I guess, just doesn't want to. I guess just like, hey, she's just going to be stuck behind this desk forever on whatever world, whatever part of the earth that she's going to be stuck on. So Jack goes off, and so Jack is to go and heal Julia. And so Jack goes back to beach and just like, okay, like what do you want me to do? Like what thing do you need me to go off and do? So these guys are going and starting to prep this nuclear bomb to be put into this drone. And so Beach is to make the statement that the drone is a weapon, and Jack is like, no, like this drone is just a machine. I'm a weapon. I'm the weapon. So all of a sudden, so Jack is to like kind of prep this drone, and so eventually they are going to go and take this thing off to eventually go and have this whole plan go off without a hitch. And then all of a sudden we end up having all these drones that are to eventually go, because evidently a Jack is to be off course, and so the drones go and try to find out where Jack is. And so all of a sudden, all these drones are to go on and start killing all of Beach's survivors, and so they go on and they go and they basically kill almost everyone off, even Beach himself. So Jack is to find out that now the drone like can't go off and do what it's supposed to do. It can't go off and nuke what it's supposed to nuke. So Jack is just like, well, I guess I'm gonna have to go. And Julia is like, well, like if you're gonna go, then we're gonna go together, and we're gonna go and just obliterate this thing. So eventually, Julia is in her little pod thing, and so Jack is going off to be in the ship and eventually taking this bomb to where it's supposed to go, to this like ship in space. So because I've kind of like I've really skimmed the cat on all the stuff that ends up happening here. I've kind of rushed it, but like oh well, like I'm just trying to get this done as quickly as possible because it's 2 hours of movie, and I also want to try to get this as quickly done as possible so I don't have like two clips all done in whichever. Plus, I have to kind of bring back certain scenes that I kind of completely forgot about. But I'm just trying to get the meat and the potatoes of this one, rather than going through every single minute detail. Um, Check out the movie. It's a visually interesting film. Um, Interesting is all that I could really say about this film. So so now since we're towards the end, plus like I guess people could have probably checked out this movie on HBO Max. I completely forgot to say. Supposedly it's really popular right now on HBO Max. I guess that was a real legitimate reason for me to have even seen this movie. Just like, oh yeah, I guess I should check this out because I've seen it once and it was such a long time ago. And I don't know, I have like this whole thing about me doing Tom Cruise movies right now. It's really just a coincidence. Hey, maybe any of these Tom Cruise movies people really like. I don't know. Like I eventually just went into Edge of Tomorrow, and then Edge of Tomorrow, all of a sudden, I just keep seeing like Tom Cruise movies eventually pop up. I'm like, oh hey, I guess I'll check that out. So, and people might feel however they are to feel about Tom Cruise and whichever. So, but yeah, so Jack is to go on to this ship that's in space, and so all of a sudden Jack is overhearing this uh, this radio call where another Jack and a Victoria are heading back to Earth, and no, where Jack and Victoria are heading back to this spaceship that is to be where Sally is, and seemingly all these number of uh, Jack and Victoria clones are to be. So eventually, Jack is to head to this ship and is to go further and further in there. And so all of a sudden, Sally is asking Jack, because it seems like he's not really being all that truthful of why he is going to dock onto the ship. And so Jack is to mention it's like, well, like I'm here to secure like our civilization, and I'm trying to uh, like make sure that everything is to like be for the benefit uh, of our species and so on and so forth. And so Sally buys that whole thing, and so eventually Jack's to go off and unleash this bomb. And before it ends up going off, Jack's to tell Sally, "You, Sally," and then like the bomb explodes, wipes out this thing. So, whatever is to be left of the survivors are, I guess, just kind of like, yeah, like we did it, woo. So eventually, I guess all these drones are, I'm assuming, to eventually be dead, unless the people who are left on Titan decide that they want to go and just put another ship out there and to forcibly just like go and like, yeah, like, well, we still need these resources, so uh but who knows, like, who knows how that was all to really break down. But like, I would assess or assume that there couldn't have just been one whole ship, that they would have really just, like, that was the end all be all, like, hey, if basically this ship doesn't work out, basically, or if they blow up the ship with Sally in it, they're basically effed. Like, I can't really justify or believe that. But so what ends up happening when eventually like the people that are on Titan don't get these resources, are eventually all of them going to die, suffocate, and whichever, because there's nobody going to be coming to give them these resources? Is that what we are to kind of expect? Was there like a part, because I believe this was part of a book, was there some kind of aftermath of this whole thing where eventually we find out that, like, oh yeah, everyone on Titan dead because they ran out of resources? I don't know. But with that said, I think I'm gonna get out of here. I'm gonna enjoy what is to be left of me figuring out what else I'm gonna be putting out today. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.